Good morning, everybody. So, kind of surprised. I was with another timetable, so I'm jumping in. We're talking. Okay, we're talking about the panel about two countries need strategic planning, and join us today. That's Francisco Gaetani, the president of the National School of Public Administration of the federal government in Brazil. And Chico, as we call it, him is a specialist in public policy and government management, and the president of ENAP, the School of Administration. And he previously in the Ministry of Planning, he's held the positions of Executive Secretary, which was the Deputy Minister of Planning, Assistant Executive Secretary, and Secretary of Management, Federal Management. He also been the Executive Secretary of Ministry of Environment and Director of Training in the National School of Public Administration. He worked for the United Nations Development Program, having held the position of General Coordination in Brazil, and in addition, he acted as Director of Government School of Minas Gerais, Fundação João Pinheiro, Plan Advisor to the Vale Company in Rio Doce, Brazil, and Project Manager of the State Office and Work and Social Action for the State of Minas Gerais. He is a licensed professor for the Foundation of Getúlio Vargas and for the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais. He holds a degree in economics from the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a doctorate in political science and a master's degree in public policy from the London School of Economics. Then we join also with Carlos Santizo, the division chief for the institutional capacity of state sector of the Inter-American Development Bank. Mr. Santizo currently holds the Innovation for Citizen Services division of the bank, which he joined in 2011 to manage the institutional capacity of the state division. He steers the bank's support to the modernization of government, strategic centers of government, public sector integrity, data-driven digital government innovations, security citizen, and judicial reform. He has worked in over 24 countries in various capacities in multilateral development banks, bilateral aid agencies, and policy think tanks. And he also served as the sector manager for governments in the African Development Bank between 2007 and 2011, and as a governance advisor to the British government between 2002 and 2007 as Senior Operations Officer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance between 1996 and 2000. He holds a PhD in Comparative Political Economics of Public Financial Accountability from Johns Hopkins University, a Master's in International Economic Policy from Columbia University, and a Master's in Public Policy from Institut Politique of Paris. He has written extensively on digital government democratization, government modernization, and foreign aid. He was a visiting fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation and a fellow at the Global Salzburg Seminar in 2018. So, last, not least, is Meg Landsager. Okay, Landsager, Public Policy Fellow at the Winston Center. Landsager consults on international economic, financial, and regulatory issues, while United States Executive Director on the International Monetary Fund Executive Board between 2007 and 2014. She focused on achieving effective IMF input into lending programs in Europe, securing adequate IMF resources, supporting low-income countries, and strengthening IMF oversight of exchange rate policies. SEGER negotiated increased emerging market representation at the IMF and promoted enhanced ethical standards and internal oversight functions. As Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade and Investments at the U.S. Treasury Department, she negotiated multilateral finance services agreements and aspects of China entry into the World Trade Organization. Also analyzed portfolio allocation decisions of institutional investors as Atlantic Fellow in London. She has a Master in International Economics from the University of Maryland and a Bachelor of Arts from American University. Please, we will start with Chico, I think, and go on, please.
Is it
it's on?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It's an opportunity for us to improve the dialogue between both countries with the participation of international experts. And in terms of representing the school here, this is really a privilege. I'll talk a little bit about strategic planning in Brazil, which is practically very close to science fiction. But it's something that, because it's not there, it does not mean that it's not necessary. And I'm not talking about the pluriannual plan, our constitutionalized, very juridified planning and budget structures, but about something broader that we should take into account, especially in the moment we're facing. Well, we have been trapped in a day that the Bill Murray film, The Hog Dog Day. Okay. We are like, in the last 4 years, we have been running there's only one show in town. Our agenda is eclipsed by anti-corruption concerns, political scandals, and the country has been involved continuously in how to change, what to do. I think that we should first take care about concentrating on what we're going through now, but being calm. I'm cautious optimist with respect to the future, but we have to get rid of this fog. And this fog is eclipsing our view. Obviously, as we know, because of we'll discuss, Walter showed, the year of the low-hanging fruits is gone. And maybe it's a good thing. Unfortunately, in Brazil, I have to say that scarcity may be a good teacher, but abundance, surely it's not. So let's try again. We have to understand who we are. Brazil is a very complex country, and we don't know whom should we target in terms of comparisons and contrasts. Our Latin American neighbors, emerging countries, the BRICS. We are permanently discussing with whom should we match ourselves. And this is not a trivial question because we are very insulated. Today we have some clear change taking place in the country. The social media communications revolution and the digital process. Jobs will not come back as they happened in the past. So we're changing our labor market as all other countries are changing, but we're changing without understanding what's happening. And this is mixed with our political and economic situation in a way that it's very hard to discern what are the major problems. And also, we're facing the ascendance of populism and nationalism as many other countries, which also didn't help us in topics like joining the OECD. We're caught in the middle of the way, and now we are a little bit confused about what should we do. What's the new normal? First, the general elections will not solve our problems. We'll provide legitimacy to the next government. The current government is a caretaking government. It was a government that ascended in the context of a crisis, but legitimacy will not be enough to face some of our difficulties. Second, the watchdogs are out. They will not come back to the previous position. And this changed completely the shift of powers between our branches. The judiciary branch is extremely empowered. Paradoxically, they are the source of uncertainty now. The public prosecutors are absolutely, they're the heroes of the current mood of the country. The Court of Accounts is now, in many ways, acting as not only a Court of Accounts, but also a player that induces government policies. And the executive and the legislative have been trapped in this corruption charge, and they didn't recover their political ascendance over the governor of the state. Some people expect renewal in the election. Others say that it's not likely because the rules of the game, especially funding politics, should not encourage the entrance of new players. Also, although, as Walter showed, the recession is going away, but growth is not at the corner. It will take time, and it will take severe adjustment policies. By the same token, I think that will not recover the unemployment rates of 4 years, 5 years ago. We'll have to handle this problem of the labor market a different way. And finally, we're facing a presidential election without choices. I'm not talking about choices between candidates. I'm talking about choices between programs, ideas, projects. It will be an election disputed on the basis of personality, symbolism, personal attributions, not about programs as we should favor the process of identification of preference. Well, that's more or less the picture of the country. Today, it's not really so original. Well, it's a collective action problem. We are used with this story. And we know that we have to overcome this situation, but apparently it will demand more than just preaching to the converted. It's a political problem of the country. We didn't, as I think Matthew was talking before, or Philippe, I don't remember, to a certain extent, we are living through a self-inflicted crisis. We can't blame the world, we can't blame the West, the European Union, oil. We can't blame the others. You know, the 2008 crisis, this is our problem. This is a country prison of short-termism. Improvisation is a national value. Imagine for Germans when they, I'm seriously, and we are very proud of being people able to improvise. And our jeitinho, the knack, it's a controversial cultural asset. Sometimes it helps us to get by in the situation. Other times they are the entry door for corruption and other practice. We're a last-minute nation, as probably the organizers know. We always finalize things at the last minute, and we don't have frontier problems in the 19th century. We lack real neighbors in the sense that we just recently found out that we are in Latin America. It's seriously. Apparently, there were some turbulent guys in the south, the Argentines, but now there's also Peru, Colombia, Bolivia. Only when the frontier achieved these other countries, we began to interact. This is a two decades topic. Before that, we were very, very isolated. And there's many other countries, big countries, inward looking. We dispute the global rankings in three complicated topics: inequality, violence, and protectionism. And the top position in two important global matters: environment and agriculture. So it's not it's not obvious even for Brazilians these things, but it's something that we should be aware of. We tried to think in long-term and strategic terms sometimes in our history, especially before the 60s. But those were indicative plans showing the direction of the country. Since the 80s, we have tried several things, but it's a stop-and-go effort. And we stop thinking the country in national terms, in global terms, in regional development and territorial terms. Probably since the real plan, the only real effort here I would point out the Territorial Planning exercise in 2007. We lost our regional development dimension. All our development processes are project-based. So in these projects, they don't dialogue with the other sectors. Power does not dialogue with transport, which does not dialogue with environment, which does not dialogue with airports, and so on. It's a silos process of thinking the country. We had, since in the last 3 decades, practically all presidents created and extinguished a Secretary of Strategic Affairs, which is strange. The same president that creates it, in another moment extinguished. These have been all very short-term efforts. So for 30 decades, we have just messed around with this challenge, and we really didn't embrace it. The argument about political culture and administrative culture is always tricky because it tends to be very conservative, as if countries didn't change, and countries change. But if you look to how our society handles trust in government and individuals, it's based on a Guy Peters, an American professor, study about administrative cultures. You see that you can contrast. So you can compare some countries in terms of trust in government, trust in individuals, and you have these metrics. Paradoxically, when you have low trust in individuals and low trust in the state, you have high administrative powers state structures, which is basically the continental Europe cell of the quadrant. And that's well, Portugal and Spain, Latin America, we're close to this one. Societies characterized by low trust in governments and low trust in individuals. And that's what explains why we have so many administrative structures in charge of prohibiting corruption, and that's why we don't have corruption in Brazil, though, because we have so many structures taking care of corruption that we don't have corruption. I'm just being sarcastic, but the point here is that the cost of transactions and the opportunity for more corruption derive exactly from this sort of situation. Obviously, the other 3 cells, they are strongly influenced by the law-based and custom traditions, not in the administrative tradition laws of the continental Europe. But that explains a little bit also how we think we can solve our problems, mainly by law. We think that the law can produce solutions for all problems. What does short-term command? Why do we have this short-termism obsession in the strategic when we talk about strategic affairs? First, people associate strategic concerns with proximity with the president, which something, they're different things, but that's not how we usually think. Second, people want to make a difference in the short term. They want to be strategic now. Third, they want to play politics. All of them want to play the big game. Fourth, all the sectors of strategic affairs, they had hidden agendas. They had short-term interests. They have their priorities. So how could they work with topics that transcend the present? Also, a paradoxical lack of international reference. We didn't dialogue with the American experience, with the European experience, German, Britain. In UK, we had the Strategic Affairs Unit with Tony Blair. He ran corporation, has been around for decades. You have CIA, and anyway, in the European Union does this sort of exercise. OECD has sponsored some of these efforts recently, but we just ignore them. Also, we don't know exactly what means long term for us in Brazil. Obviously, during the good years, long term in Brazil became next year. Now we came back to long term is tomorrow, or maybe Monday. But it's always surprising for us how people plan holidays in the North Hemisphere, because people plan 1 year in advance, 2 years in advance. Are they all Germans? And finally, we don't realize what sort of strategic capacities we need to do this sort, to engage in this sort of exercise. Why does the long run matter? We need to dialogue with the future. In order to do it, we need to know, we need to be aware about where we are, what's happening in the country. As Walter showed, for instance, our demographic structure is changing. Our electoral college is changing. Our economy changing. All these major structural changes that take years to take place, we're related with a country that's not there anymore in many ways. We don't work with scenarios. There is something important going on, for instance, with respect to Brazil and the Mercosur and the European Union. If the trade agreement takes place, that changes some things. This sort of initiative that may produce substantive change, they should be permanently analyzed, studied in terms of our scenario building process. We just don't work with this sort of methodologies. Trends, same thing. Transcending the urges of the president, backstaging, reposition, strategizing. That's not, except the military, that's not our mindset. And even the military, they are deeply involved in their budgeting struggles to prioritize their investments. So, but as a country exercise, we're not really involved in this sort of concerns. Oh, we have the opportunity of keep one eye in the present, one eye in the future. The global international agenda focused on 2030. 2022, nobody mentioned this, but we have 200 years of independence. I never heard yet in Brazil anybody talking about that. It's in the corner, you know? The next government will have this celebration. It should be a major event. It's 2022. The Paris Agreement, we have milestones. We have a very ambitious NDC, a feasible and ambitious national determined contribution based on restoration in terms of planting, restoring forests, and making good sunk carbon, sequestering carbon. And we signed the agreement 3 years ago, and we're not really realizing that we have this commitment. Many multinational firms, many UN institutions, the private sector everywhere is committed with 2050 targets in terms of carbon emissions. Carbon is something that's environment problem. It's not our problem. It's from other people. We're just not taking serious enough this sort of problem. And finally, we never pay attention in international calendars when we discuss these matters. Some words we don't have importance, and we pay a price for this. Envisioning is one of them. We can't envision a future for the country. If you don't envision what the country can be, you'll be permanently trapped in this what's the name of the animal? The Bill Murray film? Groundhog. We're permanently there, you know. We need critical mass, cumulatives, and consistency to work this sort of topic. We need platforms, networks, and dynamism in this exercise, because complexibility, you need to reduce it to make it tractable, and you have to combine quantitative and qualitative approach. We have to identify our driving force and organize our choices. We can't go on pretending that we are not making choices. It's a problem for an adolescent country, and we're permanent adolescents. We are responsible for our choices. Otherwise, who is taking charge of, who is defining the country? Finally, this means international cooperation, dialogue with the market force, the third sector, and academia. Something that in government it is still very rare. Every time we try to interact with these other players, it's confusing, it's threatening, maybe not, better no, we feel intimidated. So if the state does not open itself to this challenge, I think we will go on in this 24 hours process. Thank you very much.
Carlos, you
Yeah.
have some presentation.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Paolo, for the invitation. Although it's always a challenge to follow a Chico, because I mean, you ran out of like metaphors to explain the Brazil realities, and it's also challenging because the question of the panel was really about whether countries need strategic planning, and then you said, of course they do, no, and being in the U.S., you would remember Eisenhower that also said, basically plans are meaningless or are nothing, but planning is everything. So yeah, of course you say. But then you say, oh, we're in Brazil, we're in Latin America, and there's a big gap between reality and between the formal world and the real world, and what Gabriel Garcia Marquez, our Colombian novelist, would call the magic reality. So I think that was quite an interesting challenge that they put to our panel to discuss this issue, this sort of challenges and opportunity for strategic planning in Brazil and in the region. So I'll focus not so much, I'll focus my remarks a little bit about some of the structural challenges that are facing the Brazilian state or the bureaucracy in particular, and how strategic planning function should evolve, and also giving maybe a comparative take in our work at the Inter-American Development Bank on these issues, but also emphasizing maybe these first distinction between sort of short-term operational planning and long-term strategic planning, and the sort of capabilities that are required, especially for the strategic centers of government like the Casa Civil in the federal government in Brazil, to address those. And obviously the longer-term strategic planning really needs skills to foresee the future in many ways, and not necessarily reading a novel of Garcia Marquez, but really trying to see what are the trends that are affecting Brazil in 20, 30 years. And Chico's has really mentioned one first challenge is the concept of time in bureaucracies in Brazil and in the societies are a relative concept. And the other type of planning is also more like a shorter term operational planning, where you need much more insight, much more oversight of what the bureaucracy is actually delivering. And there's this tension between shorter term operational planning in terms of insight and focus on delivery, and longer term, more strategic planning that really looks at and requires foresight capabilities, which are very important. And we have a lot of countries, especially countries that are facing structural challenge like the United Arab Emirates, that are looking at their economies beyond oil and this type of challenges. And there's a lot of experiment in different countries on how to strengthen those functions. At the IDB in particular, we've seen quite a surge of demands for countries' capabilities to for strategic operational planning and medium-term planning in terms of delivering strategic public investment, especially in critical infrastructures. And we've been working in, for example, innovation like delivery units type of mechanisms that can help untangle some of these challenges. But in these short remarks, I just want to mention maybe four structural challenges that are really putting strategic planning, that are putting challenges also to strategic planning in the sense of, not necessarily whether it's needed, but what kind of strategic planning is needed, or strategic planning 2.0 for the new world. I think the first one that is really emerging is how governments are going to regulate the digital economy. I think this is a major challenge. We are not very used to deal with companies as many interlocutors. In a couple of days, we had the first tech ambassador in the world of Denmark that is now in Silicon Valley. And we really have like a critical challenge that how you're going to regulate this new digital economy that has no boundaries, and how you link up the domestic dimensions and the transnational dimensions of those sort of regulations. And that goes from taxation to privacy laws. And that's a concern. And I think there we have what Carl Pogliani would call a strategic, a great transformation that really requires to rethink strategic planning. And Brazil is really stepping up a little bit on these challenges as well. In March of this year, they adopted what they call e-digital, which is like a strategic sort of approach to the digital transformation of the economy and society. And that's where I think these functions of strategic planning and foresight or scenario planning will be critical, because we talk about the 20-year perspective in terms of what the challenges are and how government are going to be able to regulate and respond to those. But that also has like some dimensions to the what we call the focus of this seminar, which is the administrative state. And the second critical challenge, I think, is that Brazil really needs to reduce red tape. There's the structural issue of Costo Brazil is notorious, is very high, and reducing transaction costs for citizens and companies are something that people are actually demanding, and there's more expectation in terms of the capacities of the states to deliver in that sense. So streamlining government is really a core challenge. And we did some work with our friends at the OECD. There's a report called Government at a Glance that looks at some of these challenges in different countries. And I'll invite you all to look at this report, which is really provides a lot of good data. And there, Brazil is an outlier. And it's not only an outlier in OECD terms, it's also an outlier in Latin America terms. I think Brazil is staying behind in that curve. Regulatory reform has not progressed or is sort of like stuck. And other countries Chico has said, Brazil has discovered that it's in Latin America. Other countries in Latin America are really, stepping up the game and in some of these challenges. And the cost of Brazil is really becoming too onerous to keep on. Just one example, I mean, we were talking about social security reform, and there's an issue really about policy, of course, but there's also an issue of operational efficiency of the National Social Security Institute of Brazil. And you cannot run a system that is representing 50% of spending, as you were saying, on models of the last century. I think the digitalization of INS is really lagging behind. The model of delivery is still a model that is a little bit inadequate. It's still very traditional in that sense. So that's an example of how we can also streamline some of these processes. And I think that's the third point that was mentioned, especially that was mentioned before by Walter and others, is really the challenge, the opportunity and the challenge of digital transformation of the state in Brazil, and especially how you can leverage data, not only big data that are produced by private companies, but also open data that the Brazilian government is also putting out much more than before, and how you're going to leverage that, and what kind of skills also you require in government to make most advantage of those. I think that I think that's it's both a challenge and an opportunity to reduce red tape and make government more agile. And there, Brazil is also advancing. I think there's a new digital government strategy that has been approved in 2016 and should be updated with the next government. You created what they call the National Council for Democratization last year, with the programs with the Simplifique or others. And I think that there's a strong ownership and drive from the Casa Civil in particular to drive this type of process, which is not a sector, it's across governments, all government. I think that's one of the challenge we see in Brazil is really the Casa Civil in the federal government in particular is strong, but I think there's more spaces to strengthen that function more. And we see that in particular how the government is going to manage this digital transformation of government. And I think there's still need for broader strategic planning in terms of what are the structural changes that these are bringing to the way government is operating inside and interacting with citizens outside, including the Portal de Servicio. And Brazil has a very sophisticated Portal de Servicio where they try to put online all the government services, which is good, but it's not necessarily what countries are doing in terms of digitalizing the services. It's not only that you can access the information about a service that you need to do, like you were mentioning your passport or something, is that the entire process is digitalized. And so there's much more to be done. And there's much more to be done in terms of, we think also in terms of the governance of digital government. And the model of Brazil led by the ministry is one, but there's a little bit of fragmentation. So that's where I think the concept of strategic planning is key, because it's not only like putting together in motion a sector policy, but it's really a radical transformation of government in the next decade or so. And this is coming, and it's coming fast. And I think linked to that, I think Brazil is also quite making, maybe paradoxically, but also making a lot of efforts to open up its own government data to make it more transparent. You were mentioning the oversight agencies like TCU, but the CGU also, the ministry is quite active. Has been quite a leader in some of these processes. For example, the transparency portal of the federal government of Brazil is quite good by international standards. And they have things like the Observatory of Public Spending that is actually doing data mining and crossing data from different sources to raise red flags. So there's increasingly data intelligence being generated in Brazil, and I think for example, the National Open Data platform and the data analyst platform that has been relaunched last year, it's called GovData. It's really an interesting tool to make governments more intelligent in the way they use data and leverage that data. But that brings me to my fourth and last point is really also about, really the structural challenge that the strategic planning function should look at is the future of work in the public sector. We talk a lot about the future of work in the economies that the digital revolution is bringing, but we need to also think about the future of work in the public sector, and that is in terms of both the impact that the digital transformation of governance will have on the public sector. I mean, there's like efficiency gains, but there's also issues around public services. There's also the issues of digital skills that are required in the public sector, and that will be increasingly required. I think there, just to mention the ENAP is also one of the institutions that we look at in Latin America that is trying to also promote programs to mainstream digital skills in the public sector. But we have a whole series of issues related to the digital skills in civil service and what will be the impact in the longer term of the future of work in the public sector. Especially, I think, looking at how you need to bring more less lawyers and more data scientists, basically. I think, sorry about that, I needed to say that.
Walter, did you hear?
No, and that brings back to this point about the administrative culture in terms of the legal, the contradiction that there's a regulatory addiction, or you will solve problems by law, and actually the entire game is actually how you avoid and circumvent the law, which makes quite interesting games. But they're the issue, and one of the issues we see that a lot of countries are facing is how you manage the digital skills in government. The CADR, Spain, for example, has established a full, like economists, they have a digitalist. But I think that's one of areas where schools, like institutions like ENAP, have a really important role to play. So I think that was that was the fourth and last challenge that I think that that we are facing for strategic planning. Just in conclusion, the challenge with Brazil is that it's not one country; it's like so many countries in one. And I think the challenge is one that you look at these issues at the federal level of government, but I think we need to look at the state level of government, especially because most public services are provided by states in Brazil, and therefore what we see is a lot of inequalities in terms of different approaches between Minas Gerais, that is maybe in one league, and other states. So the challenge is also from the federal government, how you also help subnational governments in the states to take those forward, and including big cities, because Brazil is becoming increasingly urbanized. So thank you.
Meg, please.
Well, Paulo, thank you very much for inviting me. And I have to say, I'm really amazed at how all your speakers so far this morning, it's completely resonated with my experience in government. And so I'm going to make this a little bit personal in terms of my years at the Treasury and at the IMF, because I was more of an implementer of what was perceived to be the plan, the objectives of many, I must say, different administrations over the years. And similar in being a civil servant who became a political appointee, so having that same experience of moving throughout the system as well. But one thing that really struck me as I started refreshing my memory on this, because I haven't really looked at what is the U.S. strategic plan, when I looked at, is there a United States strategic plan? Well, no. There is not a single overall, this is the United States strategic plan. There's a national security strategy, all right? That's something different. And that drives a lot of what the government does then, all the different agencies, what the president puts to the Congress. But at a different level, there are strategic plans in the U.S. government. So there's a U.S. law, first passed in 1993, the Government Performance and Results Act, and it was modernized in 2010, and it requires each agency, each cabinet secretary, to produce a strategic plan and present it. And so I went and looked. Treasury has a strategic plan that it put out in the past few months after the inauguration, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But you know, listening to my colleagues here, you know, I wonder, should the U.S. as a whole, should it have a overarching strategic plan that would set the goals, sort of domestic and international, and try and bring it all together? And I think, in some sense, that would make a lot of sense. If you look at how we actually operate, there's certain aspects of that that really do happen every year. We have the President's State of the Union. He goes up to Congress and presents, you know, what he wants to do in the next year, but it also often goes beyond that. And then the president sends a proposed budget to Congress, which of course then takes many months and never gets voted on as a whole, but gets voted on piecemeal, all the different agency budgets. So in that respect, that reveals a strategic plan for the United States, because in covering all the agencies, it has international with the State Department in there, AID, the international aspects of the different agencies, as well as all the domestic programs. So it does give you maybe a broad picture of what the goals are of an administration, and there are some out-year projections as well. So in that sense, we do have a bit of a strategic plan. But when I think about it, what's useful about a strategic plan? And I think a lot of what everyone's been saying here really lays out why it's useful to have one, even if difficult to implement. And I think the first thing is accountability. I mean, everybody has talked about accountability, and it's a way of setting out, this is what I plan to achieve, this is how I'm going to do it. And then the public, journalists, anybody, members of Congress can go back and look, well, how are you doing? You said you'd try and do this, and either you have or you haven't, why or why not? So it does make sense. It can set out goals throughout an administration. Goals can apply to all agencies or some agencies, and what you want to have is, you know, some sort of, how are you going to achieve those goals? So I looked at a Treasury plan from, you know, about 15 years ago with Secretary John Snow then, back in the Bush administration, and he listed the partners on the international side that the U.S. would need to work with. I thought, well, that's great. You know, it lists there the countries the U.S. would work with, you know, the other, whether it was G20, G7, the international institutions, IMF, World Bank, trying to achieve it. So it really was trying to bring things back together, which I thought was very sensible. So there's been a lot of talk of partners, that you need to work with others to actually achieve a lot of what you're doing. But a lot of what you need in a plan, too, in terms of how you implement it is, what do you need legislation for? Brazil knows, the United States knows. Not always so easy to get legislation through a parliament or a Congress. And so what can you do versus rules and regulations? You know, what can be implemented, what can be changed by independent agencies or by agencies without necessarily doing that. And of course, in a plan, you want to have, some have mentioned scenarios, but also this sense of, well, what if? What happens if things go this way or that way? Are we prepared to react? What are some of the impediments? How could we react? What are some of the, you know, everybody likes to do fan charts now. What are the probabilities of growth being much higher or growth being much lower, the fiscal outturn? How would we react to that? And so, and then you want the accountability. You know, as you were saying, Carlos, you know, you want to be able to monitor what's going on. And I noticed in one document this spring that a sub-agency at Treasury actually had, boom, 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 this is what you need to do, and you need to report back to whatever agency it was on specific targets on what they had to do the first quarter of 2018. So very specific. What I don't know is, what does it mean if you don't achieve those? Right? How is that accountability then enforced? And that's what's not so clear. But other things that sort of struck me in listening today is you also have to think about what's the public support for what you're trying to do? Do you have broad public support behind you that'll help you implement it? Because remember, you also need the state and local governments, right? You're all talking about the entire administrative system. You need state and local governments to be helping you on a lot of things, being partners. What's the public support for what you're doing? Or if there's public resistance, but nonetheless, there's a vision, and the U.S. is good at vision. You know, all presidents are good at envisioning where the U.S. should go, even though the details of how to get there sometimes are a little bit unclear. But that's what you need in terms of translating how you're going to do, you know, achieve what you want to do. So if you're going to make this work and have a government try and deliver on these, you do need that central authority, I'd say, in a president's office that holds the agencies accountable. And so my experience all the time when I was at Treasury was all the time being called over to the old executive office building next to the White House, where, you know, someone there was pulling together all of us. This was, you know, trade investment negotiations back in the late 90s when I was running that office at Treasury. It was, come over and, you know, what are you doing? Okay, Meg, what did you achieve? The State Department person, the AID, whatever was in that group. What did you achieve? Okay, we're trying to get the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act through Congress. What are you doing? Who are you talking to? What are the different groups? Who are you pulling in? Who, the public, in terms of what's the reaction? Can we get the support? It was always, and I was on the National Security Council staff for a while in the early 90s. It was, you know, and I did a lot of that myself. I would call people together and make sure that we're all on the same page. So you can use it, and I admit when I was at Treasury, at times I used that to stymie what I thought were bad policies by rounding up some other agencies, and there'd be 4 or 5 of us sitting in a meeting, and it's like, no, we don't think that's a good idea. And it wouldn't happen. So, I mean, you can use it, you know, either way, but, you know, you yourself have to have that vision, and you yourself have to have a sense that you'll be backed in doing that. That, you know, I felt that my bosses at Treasury, when I was at Treasury, you know, would support what I was doing and back me up when then someone got mad enough they called a higher level meeting and dragged in the cabinet secretaries or the deputies, right, and trying to overrule us. So I had to make sure that I had their backing if I was going to take a hard line on something, or if I was going to really push something, because I wanted them to be supporting that and pushing it too, or it wouldn't happen. So in a bit, that was my experience at the IMF as well. You know, of course, I always had my personal strategic plan, what I thought was important that my office at the IMF should be trying to get the IMF to do. But I also needed to make sure I had Treasury on my side, because Treasury then had to work with other capitals to make sure that those other capitals told their representatives at the IMF, yeah, this is an important policy initiative, you should support that. Because just because I said, and this is the way it worked at the IMF, everyone thought because I represented the United States, the largest member of the IMF, that the US could get whatever it wanted. Well, the US has about 16% of the vote. 16% is nice, but that doesn't mean you get what you want. You need to get 51%, and not just 51%. Nothing works at the IMF if it's 51%. You've got to get, a super majority. You've got to get a lot of support, because if you don't, it won't be implemented effectively. So you can try and push something through with a squeaker, like, okay, we got, 52% of the board supporting it. And guess what? It's not really going to happen very effectively. So my whole time at the IMF was working with my 23 board colleagues, and we would go around and lobby each other, ask each other, what are your positions? And it was always Treasury. You got to get back to the capitals, get back to whether it was Tokyo or capitals in Europe or occasionally Brasilia, right, to try and help us achieve something. And many times, a lot of what we were doing at the IMF in terms of changing the voting power, I was aligned with the BRICS, right? Because the US was pushing changing voting power to better reflect the growing, the growing economies in the emerging markets and developing countries. And in doing that, the US was willing to, and it did not take up what it really could take up in terms of its share of the global economy, basically stay where it was, but that meant 100% is 100%, that meant someone else, other countries, had to give up ownership shares, give up percentage share. So of course, who's overrepresented? Europe, right? So getting Europe to give up share so that we could have more in the emerging markets was really, really tough. And even though there's been progress, it's, you know, there really is a lot further to go. Now, the new challenge, for those of you who care about this, will be looking at China in the future. China could eat up any increase in the future of, you know, IMF votes. And in doing that, where does that leave the rest of the emerging markets, right? Because it'll be very hard, and China will then be in the position the US has been in. Well, maybe we shouldn't take up everything that we could so that there's more for our emerging market partners. So we'll see in the future. But always that accountability, and I spent a lot of time with Congress too, the last couple of years I was at the IMF and when I was at Treasury too earlier, trying to convince them that this was a good thing to do. It was a good thing to do to pass this legislation in Congress because the US was protecting its share while the IMF was becoming more representative of the real world. And why was it important to have that? Because you need emerging markets, developing countries, China too, to feel like it has a stake in this international organization, which I have to say, as much as we would argue, fight, and is really pretty effective. And when something out of the IMF can work quickly, put something together, the membership can come together. When you're sitting around that table, you have central bankers. They can be pretty conservative, frankly. You have central bankers and finance ministry, for the most part, not totally. And they understand each other. They understand what the problems are. They can reach decisions, work with capitals, and bring it back. So it really took quite a bit of that partnership work. But always, you know, I was operating with my vision in mind, my strategic plan, you might say, and knowing that I had the full backing of the Treasury Department and that they were doing their bit and constantly working with my partners. So that's how you use a strategic plan, how, you know, being more of an implementer, but in a certain sense, it was how I operated, how I showed accountability. And after I left, I was dragged up twice before Congress to testify and defend myself on why I voted for those programs in Greece, right? And it was like, well, members of Congress, it was to preserve global financial stability and not have a further worse meltdown than we already did in 08-09. But anyway, that's what accountability means, and you know, you have to take that as well, but it really is a way then too of educating the public. So let me stop there. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Before we start with the questions, if you may, I have some of my own. And the title of the panel is "Do Countries Need Strategic Planning?" And this is kind of tricky because I know Chico went with this. And in Brazil, we have something of plan versus strategic planning. It's not the same. And the fact in the Constitution, we have the need for a plan. And planning in this kind of fashion is like a document. And then a document, a straight document, don't say anything usually. And even in companies, I know a recent study of published in Economist last year. We talked with the CEOs, and even the CEOs at the private sector are 90% of the strategic planning are not implemented. And so, and this is very strict on because the sector is smaller, it's easier to contain the place of actors. In terms of government, this plan for me is not really feasible. It's not a thing you can ask for. Usually a president in our type of regime, even the United States or Brazil, who have a president, a strong person, and they need to have some vision. And in America, they American is more like the vision. In Brazil is a little bit more about the person, but the personality. But okay, I have a vision, and there's some kind of a plan in the scope of the goals for the government before the election. And when they took office, this changed a lot because the Congress is different and the public opinion is different. And usually you have like 100 days or so of good government power in the Congress. In Brazil, I think in America is like kind of similar. And this window of opportunities, it's when that things in the campaign they are wishing for, this is the opportunity to change something. The problem is usually in Brazil it's worse because in Brazil the parties are very fragmented. So the parties don't have enough manpower and intellectual power to draft real plans of government before. And when they took office, they need to lean in the civil servants who already are in the government to know how to do something. And this takes time, and they lose a lot of opportunities in the first period. The thing I was kind of wanting your opinion in is one president has a vision, has a kind of a plan, but usually short-sighted, it's not very long. How this combine with this kind of, I need to have a national plan for a long time, a long run, and these long runs in this new scenario in the 21st century, who are changing a lot, and new technologies and etc. And these errors of projection combined in a long-term plan makes this plan like unreachable, because it's a problem. In Brazil, if the Social Security reforms take 3 years to pass, not 2 years, change everything, and I don't know what kind of money we'll have in the future, and the projections of GDP and inflation, and etc. Everything changes, so every kind of aspect of the society changes also, and the plans go through the drain. So, and it's impossible to do this kind of multiple scenarios for every possible hypothesis in the future. And this is like a very constraining in Brazil. A lot of people are, and we need to do planning, but what kind of planning? In the sector, okay, it's easier to do this kind of individual plans in the agency plans, but this kind of grows a lot of model for a whole country. I think is a little unreachable. And so, if you may, I don't think I set myself clear. That's my concern, basically.
Well, I think that's a totally valid concern, and frankly, it's not just the U.S. and Brazil that face that kind of problem. It's pretty much any country, in terms of being able to look very far ahead. I mean, the IMF loves to do projections, so I have in front of me government debt projections through 2023. So when you look at it, they're saying the net debt, excluding what's held by the Federal Reserve, the U.S. debt could go up to 90% of GDP. Well, that's really high. But according to the administration, after this tax reform, we're going to have so much growth that revenues are going to be so high, right, that debt's going to go away. Well, who do you believe, right? You've got IMF projections, and they put it in a global context. You've got the Congressional Budget Office doing its they're the official projectors, so to speak, right? Yeah. And they've got big numbers too. All you have to do is look at our Social Security projections. I'm like in your age category, Paolo, and we're going to be a big drain on U.S. resources. What are we doing about it? We're not doing anything about it. Yet, why is it important to be thinking ahead? I think it's my children. Don't most of us have children? Don't most members of Congress, presidents, have children and then grandchildren? They should be thinking of what kind of burden are they leaving for them? And that's just not happening in the United States. And I'm not quite sure why we can't get to that, because we have in the past, and we know. And when you look at even the National Security Review that this administration did, you know, it has points in there about, you know, exactly the kinds of things you've been talking about. We've got to get ready for the new economy, what's going on, you know, whether it's digital, to look at in terms of we need to improve education so that people are better prepared to meet whatever comes. All that's kind of in there, but I don't see it translating into specific proposals in either different departments, or a lot of it, since a lot of these kind of services are state and local, working with them. So in the United States, we leave that up to the private sector. All right, and we assume, there's a lot of assuming in the United States, oh, the private sector, you know, we're a basic private economy, is going to figure this out. So if you start looking at things, you do have a lot of companies working with community colleges and that sort of thing to try and change some of the training so that students come out with like a 2-year degree or 4-year degree with the skills that will make them employable. And what I learned watching my children go through their education is the most important thing children have to learn is how to learn, how to adapt, how to change. I mean, that's been the theme of everybody this morning, right? We've got to be ready for change. And if our kids can't learn how to adapt, can't learn how to teach themselves something new, be willing to do that, you always really have to be doing that. So that's a big challenge in the US, and I regret that we're not meeting that. The one thing that gives me a little bit of reassurance, and I say this, you know, knowing my colleagues at Treasury and a few of the other departments, is that there is a core of really dedicated, talented civil servants in the United States. And when you look at, for instance, if you look at that Treasury plan, there's a lot of specifics in there, and that was written by career civil servants. So they're there, they know, they're ready, they can react, they can put things together. I just hope it's not when things are too late or it gets so bad that it ends up being a really radical adjustment. You know, I mean, the IMF theme this year is adjust while times are good. Haven't we all heard that many times? Well, we're not doing it, but I certainly wish we would.
If anybody has some questions or want to
Yeah.
comment.
No, maybe just like a couple of points to react, but I think one of the fundamental things that we see also in Brazil, but not but in the rest of Latin America, goes back to what, you know, Chico's point about the lack of programmatic parties, and political parties are not coalescing necessarily always around a program and a plan and a vision, so that you have a challenge that sometimes elections are fought around one specific issue. And this is quite an interesting, I mean, this year is going to be quite interesting all the way to the end of the year, because you have 8 elections in major countries in Latin America, and the latest ones in Costa Rica or Paraguay. You also see this tendency that, you know, parties are not necessarily putting together a program and a vision for societies, and like in the case of maybe in Costa Rica, the vote tends to just polarize around one single issue, kind of election. So it becomes a little bit challenging, and Brazil has this challenge maybe more than others because of the electoral system and political party system. But that also, and the second point is also one of the things of going back to the point of the culture of the public administration, and especially in the area of planning. And I think maybe one way to look at it is like, you know, we should get over privileged in the sense of having a new strategic planning function 2.0. And I'm saying that as a Frenchman because, for example, in France, you have a long tradition of strategic planning for 5 years, plans in the Commissariat Général au Plan. And this has died down into a new form of planning around an agency that is called France Stratégie, which are looking at specific challenges that are going to transform the society, the economy, or the state in 20 years. And it's really more about foresight rather than planning. And that also requires different types of skills and approaches that are less about, you know, a formal process, but more about foresight thinking. And the last point I think Megan made also an important thing is that it only will work is if the center of government, in this case, for example, in the case of Brazil, the Casa Civil is a strong one, and it's not only the political muscle, but it's also the sort of technical muscles behind structural changes in government. And I think there are a lot of countries are trying to strengthen these capacities in this part of government. And some states in Brazil, and Francisco knows Minas Gerais in particular, but you can look at Pernambuco with under Eduardo Campos. I also like looking at a much more professional way to run government, setting targets, all ministries and line agencies accountable around a plan that is also transcribed into targets. And I think that's also a cultural shift in terms of these things, because it's not necessarily the traditional sort of accounting exercise, but much more an agile exercise. And countries like the UK, I mean, the Cabinet Office in the UK is a very powerful center of government that we don't necessarily have in Latin America, the equivalent. Or even, well, in the Jefatura de Gabinetes, Argentina has also strengthened his core, his central core. And I think that's one of the challenges, how you translate these sort of good plans into actually delivery programs where the chief executive, the president, is looking at those every on a regular basis.
Thank you for these presentations. Listening to the different perspectives, it really got me thinking about what are the particularities of the United States and of Brazil in particular with regard to Western Europe, where we see a long tradition of strategic planning. And I think part of it is that these two systems are quite politicized. So if you're looking at the assistant secretary, deputy assistant secretary, going quite far down, these positions change with each administration. It doesn't mean they're better or worse, but where is that administrative vision that works alongside the political vision? Political appointees, they're there to get reelected. They're there to achieve the goals of an administration within the term of that administration. So there's nothing wrong with that, but that's going to be the timeline. So if you ask them to think beyond that, the incentives completely skew against it. One thing, though, which hasn't come up yet in this discussion, is that a lot of this vision and thinking and strategy actually exists outside of government. It exists in think tanks. It exists here, for example. There's this deep tradition of thinking and policy entrepreneurship, which provides sort of a reservoir of ideas that government can tap into. And if you don't like the direction that the government's going, you can bring in the next gang, and they've been thinking about it over that time. So that's something that perhaps rather than saying we need strategic planning or we don't need strategic planning, how do we create that ecosystem which provides that capacity to do that deep thinking, to provide that continuity that extends beyond the electoral cycle?
Hello, Paulo Castro from the University of Brasilia and also a research fellow here at the American University. I'd like to ask Francisco Gaetani a question regarding federalism. In Brazil, we're a big federalist state, and in which by constitutional provision, all levels of government, federal, state, and local level governments need to work together to bring the agenda of, let's say, education and public safety and others. And on my experience working in the federal government for many years, taught me that sometimes when things go wrong with public policy in Brazil, it doesn't necessarily means that it's a problem involving money or budget, but the lack of state capacity to implement those policies. I mean, when you come to local authorities, they sometimes lack the personnel or training and the skills to implement policy. And after 2, 3, 4, 5 years struggling together, they end up sending the money back to the federal government because they couldn't find a solution. How do you think these challenges in strategic planning in Brazil?
I would like to add just one element here. One of the most important issues nowadays for citizens is healthcare, right? The populations are getting older, they're living longer, and they need more care. Actually, if you want to never be unemployed in the United States, be a nurse. Train for that. And that's the example I like to use. In Brazil, we have a system that is not prepared to benefit from, for instance, the things that you can do in e-government, in education, because our system, the university system in Brazil, sometimes it's really an obstacle for progress, because you cannot start, for instance, as you can here. I know a person that had a biology major in a very good liberal arts college, and then decided that he wanted to be a nurse. And he completed his nursing school at Georgetown University in precisely 16 months, because everything he had done before was incorporated. Similar example, a person that went to McGill School, did pre-med, then went to Brazil, wanted to be a doctor, had to go to the exam again, and started in the first year of medical school at the University of São Paulo, which is one of the best. And she told me, she's now a wonderful doctor in Brazil, and she told me that once she was having a class of, I don't remember the topic, but the professor was impressed to say, where did you learn so much about this topic? So, because the author of this book that you use in class was my teacher at McGill. Nothing that she learned at McGill was accounted for her degree at the University of São Paulo. This is some of the things, that the amount of energy and money that we spend unnecessarily. And this is a topic that everybody understands. You need better doctors, better nurses, better healthcare service. But the structure, and this is the comparison between the United States. The United States is a country built from the bottom up. We do the opposite. The structures, and they are very protective, and the university professors are very protective of those things, because the less competition, the better. I'd like to also comment on this, because you can do all strategic plans. They may be very good on paper, but if you don't change that, you can invest all kinds of money. You're not going to have a good
I will
result.
jump one point about this, Paulo, and about the last question about this. We are talking about the political appointees versus the staff, and I see a problem about the staff in this cases, because, like the political appointees, the first preoccupation, the first worry they have is to be reelected. So all the other things are secondary. I want to do this country, this, that, but I want to be reelected. I want to get power. And the problem with it's kind of naive thinking about the public servants, like, no, I just want the country goes. Wow. No, I want to get my job secured. I want to get my institution with power in the government. So my experience is like, every time you lean to this kind of assistance, it's not bad per se, but it's like, okay, I do my strategic planning, but I want my institution to be strong. Like the professors, that's my point. The problem is the strategic planning of the education system in Brazil is driven by professors of the universities. That's why in the federal government we spend like 74%, 75% in universities versus the basic school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because all the people and all the secretaries of the Ministry of Education and all the people who work with that are professors. They want the universities to have power. And that's kind of a feeling, but and this is not, I cannot solve this problem, but I need to appoint it for you because of the Paulo questions.
Comments?
Can you?
Yeah, there was a question for you.
Well, very interesting points. I'd like to begin about the discussion about the plan. I think that George mentioned, it's important to distinguish between the plan and the exercise, the methodology of strategic planning. But the problem is that thanks to the Court of Accounts activities, today the Chief of Staff enacted a decree that the country will have to produce a strategic 12 years plan. It was induced by the Court of Accounts exactly to hold the government accountable in the long run. So I agree that, well, I personally think, and I discussed this a lot with my colleagues in Brazil, I think that we should free the planners from the constitutional text, because it's just a little ritual or procedure. It's not planning there, it's just paperwork. But unfortunately, the juridification of the planning killed it. But now we have another opportunity to make something different. Anyway, it was responding pressure of the Court of Accounts. The Chief of Staff Minister enacted this decree in the context of a governance structure. The second point made about Santizo, about the executive coordination in the center of the government. Luis Alberto was 12 years at the Chief of Staff Ministry, in principle, in a position of control everything, monitor everything, analyze the merit of everything. That's not how reality happens. The agenda congestion at the center is permanent, and the capacities to monitor, to oversight, and to discuss everything that happens in the government, it's challenging to put in place these capacities, and especially if you are in a centralized presidential system in which the Chief of Staff is really the last resource before the president. But anyway, the capacity should be spread elsewhere. And I think you made a point, Edwin, that part of this debate is about the thinking ahead. This is not a government problem exclusively. It's also the society problem. In fact, I came to this panel today replacing Hussein Kalut, the current strategic affairs. And the challenge is to engage the country in this sort of community, in this dialogue. Otherwise, we can't combine in a synergic way these trends. The federalism topic, Paulo, it was just the object of last week meeting in the National Development Council, because we have many unfinished business in our federalist design. This variable geometry of Brazilian federalism, which enables everybody to do everything, it's very confusing for foreigners and also for we also. But this was the Constitution decision in '88. And they decided, in order to enable different arrangements in Rio Grande do Sul, in Amazon, the federal government should be more protagonist. In Rio Grande do Sul, states and municipalities should be more proactive, let's say. And sometimes the country looks exhausted. We wanted clear competencies. And then they approve a legislation like they did it in the environmental ministry. Well, now let's license federal level, state level, local level. Immediately, in the day after, we had the problem of the capacities. The states can't do it, the municipalities can't do it. So how to tackle simultaneously the state capacity issue and the federalism trade-off, the federal trade-offs, we don't know. We have, if you look to our policies, education, health, social development, environment, security, the federal government just created a Ministry of Security. It does not have competence. It does not have a mandate to handle state problems, but it's just to respond to public demand. So these are our confusions and trade-offs. Fernando, in the last panel, will tackle the issue of state capacity, which is exactly one of our major concerns. The school, we just changed the statute of the school to work with municipalities, because in the previous regime, we couldn't work with municipalities because it was not our mandate. As if an intergovernmental policy didn't demand you to train, to form, to work with municipalities and states. Your point, Paul, about the nurses and doctors is a point about engineers. We are protectionists not only in trade, we are protectionists in terms of the professions. If you want, let's say that you decide that given the corruption scandals, let's open our engineer market to foreign firms. Let's suppose that you decide this. You can't do it because the foreign engineers, they are not allowed to,
They need the CREA.
they're not allowed to sign projects there. The market, the labor market of the engineers protects the country from this sort of decision. And finally, the capacity challengers. We are in a moment that, given the anti-corruption surge, the country evolved from judicialization to criminalization, and finally to paralyzed. We're paralyzed. And the watchdogs are very empowered, very entrenched, and they're very professional. The core civil servants at the executive, they are under siege. And the country is a little bit stuck between this situation, how to move, risk avoidance, challenge. We have to accelerate the process of developing capacities, but at the same time, some of the challenges are not waiting. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to come back on the first question on how do you get beyond the electoral cycle. That is always a challenge, and we've got our midterm elections this fall and already making a lot of news with the primaries that are underway all over the country, upending some of the traditional structure in both parties. Both parties are facing this in the United States. So it will be very interesting to see what happens in the fall. We have the Speaker of the House retiring, Paul Ryan. He's been the one who's had the vision about entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, all that. We've got to do something about them. But he couldn't generate, the interest. And of course, President Trump promised not to touch any of that, even though that is the future of the United States, this huge drain on the budget. So, but to get past the electoral cycle, sometimes presidents do have in mind, what's going to be my legacy? What am I going to be remembered for, not just in the history books, but in the next 5, 10 years, not just 100 years from now? And sometimes that can be a little bit of a restraint. We haven't seen that yet, currently, but I think over time, when we see that some of these policies are not generating the results that were anticipated, maybe there'll be a bit of a rethink. And so the question is, major changes like in tax legislation, you do need the Congress. So I was a little disappointed in this tax bill that it gave too much away, given the demands on the budget, on the spending side. And there's just so much waste, fraud, and abuse that you can cut. Always a familiar line of, okay, we're going to save a lot of money. No, you never save a lot of money that way. You actually have to cut some programs or change how you administer those programs. So, but not happening yet, but I can only hope that there will be that awakening, that public perception of, wait a minute, this isn't quite working. And you do have enough problems in state and local governments in terms of meeting their own pension obligations that at some point, they may be turning to the federal government as well for, wait a minute, we can't cover all this. You're going to have to make sure Medicare takes care of, Social Security. So, but if we don't act until we're ready to go over that cliff, that'll be really unfortunate because it'll impede all these other things that are so important for the future of the dynamism of the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just one concluding point for me. I think what the central challenge we see in Brazil and we see in other countries is really how you're going to restore trust of citizens in government at different levels. I mean, at the end of the day, both in terms of the quality of services, I think people in Brazil are asking for a lot of things, especially the growing middle class that really have more aspiration, greater expectation in a society that is younger, that is urbanized. 80% of Brazil is urbanized. So there's an issue really about, there's a sort of social pact behind the trust of citizens between government and we see these things both, how the big corruption scandals are affecting that. And we're talking about the state-owned enterprise reform that was mentioned. But it's also the daily red tape, the daily interaction with governments that we see, and the Transparency International figures are quite, problematic in terms of the number of you know, around 20%, 30% of people pay bribes to get a service they're entitled to. I mean, this is quite huge. And restored trust is also, you know, critical because you have a paralysis, as Chico was mentioning, that is quite concerning in terms of, we see that in public investment in particular, but it's actually the entire bureaucracy is becoming so risk averse that nobody's approving anything. And the figures, for example, in Peru are suggesting that 2% of GDP has gone because of paralysis of major infrastructure projects at a time where infrastructure is critical. So my point there is really about how you restore trust in government, and going back to, and that also linked to the issue of health. You know, you talk about health, that's very interesting as a sector. I think you can talk about the justice sector in particular as well, but in the health sector, the issue there you have is that there's a lot of potential for improvement through telemedicine or digital health records. But the issue there is data privacy. And the governance of data is becoming a major issue, and that's being embroiled into this issue about trust in government. You don't, with all what's it's happening, do we trust government with our data? Who owns the data? How do we protect the data from cyber attacks? There's a number of issues there that also about some of the structural challenge that the region faces, but it goes down and it boils down how the next government will be able to reset in motion a trust mechanism between states and citizens.
I think we are at the end of our time. So thank you very much, everybody, and for a wonderful panel. Thank you, all the audience.